Welcome back, everybody. Let's give a warm welcome to Alex Doubet. Alex began his career at U.S. Road Sports, an endurance event company that owned over 24 events with over 120,000 participants across the country. U.S. Road Sports was sold to Lifetime Fitness in the beginning of 2014. At U.S. Road Sports, Alex was the director of finance. Subsequent to that, Alex was the chief operating officer and junior partner of Advantix Marketing, a search engine marketing and optimization agency and a member of the 2015 Inc. 5000 list. Throughout his career, Alex has bought and sold houses and multifamily apartment complexes. He has consistently been disappointed by how expensive the transaction costs are when selling real estate, and he's building a better, more cost-effective service at Door.com. Alex is a graduate of Harvard University with an AB in history and a secondary concentration in economics. Let's all please welcome Alex Doubet.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining this morning. Really glad to be here. And I'm going to walk through just for a few minutes here and take some questions at the end, but walk through what I like to think of as the more difficult side perhaps of entrepreneurship and the stuff that you don't frequently see in the headlines and the stuff that you don't frequently read about in the articles when you see the news about the latest funding round or the news about the latest exit or whatever the case may be. But I'll start briefly just with the question as to why I started the company, why I started Door.com. And it really comes down to a pretty straightforward and simple personal experience, one that hit pretty close to home. And this is going back now about 7 years ago, but there's a picture of me on screen when I was a good deal younger, obviously, and that's my mom. And about 7 years ago now, my mom sold her house, and she'd owned it for 20, 25 years. And she sold it, and she used a traditional real estate agent, and she paid 6% commission to do so. And for her, that was tens of thousands of dollars out of her pocket. And she told me that story, and I don't know that I would have ever done anything but for the fact that she just mentioned that she hadn't even gotten a thank you note. So here she was, she spent tons of money selling the house that she'd owned for 20 years, and she didn't get a thank you note when all was said and done. And so thinking about that problem a little bit more specifically, I took a look at some data surrounding what the median home seller experiences when they go through this transaction. So there on screen, the median home seller in the country is selling a house that's about $190,000. And if your home is, say, $500,000 or $600,000 in the more expensive parts of DFW, for instance, you can more or less triple these numbers, and they hold about true. But the median home seller in the country has about 71% of their house value in debt when they go to sell their home. And they have about 29% of their home value in equity when they sell their house. And so zooming in on that equity piece, something becomes really interesting, I think, which is the home equity is what you take when you sell your house. That's your reward for owning the house, so to speak. But if you have $55,000 of home equity and you're paying 6% commission to a real estate agent, fully 21% of your home equity, of your gains on that house, have gone to just transaction costs. And I just fundamentally don't think that's a particularly fair way for the space to work. And so when I started Door, the fundamental principle that we started it on was we can deliver a better experience and only charge people $5,000. And we did that. We launched, and we saw exceptionally fast growth there in the first few years. I actually started, I just passed my 5-year anniversary last month. I started in October 2015, and we had our first transaction close in 2016. And 2016 was a just wildly exciting year. This is just a graph of our closes over the course of that 2016 year. We started slowly, as all things have to. And we were kind of plugging along, but 2016 was a great year, and we raised money that year. So we raised an $800,000 seed round. We raised about $2.4 million, I think it was, later in 2017. But 2016 was a great year. Looking at 2017, holy cow, an even better year. And you can see on your screen there, one of the things that always struck me is you think you're doing great that last year, but then if you continue to see success, those really big numbers, or at least that felt big the year prior, suddenly look really small in the rearview mirror. So we raised money in 2018. Similarly, was a really good year. We kept growing. You see some of the seasonality. January is always the low month in the market, but we kept growing like crazy. And through the end of 2018, things were going phenomenally well. And we thought heading into 2019 that the future looked fantastically rosy. We thought that that was going to continue turning out just as 16 and 17 had been going. And I think in some sense it did. 2019 was a good year, but it's perhaps fair to say that 2019 was also when we started to see some issues. Something just fundamentally wasn't going as it had in the past. And so looking now, updating it up to 2020, you can see really where this issue started taking hold. And granted, there's a worldwide pandemic going on right now, and a large part of this is due to the pandemic. The real estate market was hit particularly badly, and inventories down massively year over year. But nevertheless, what I want to talk about in large part is that downward slope there, and the question of what happened. Why do we see this great success? And if you just looked at 2016 through 2018, we were one of the top 10 or 15 percentile companies, top 10 or 15% growth companies in the country. We were one of the fastest growing companies in the entire United States. We went from having done $0 in 2015 to we rounded out 2018 having done about $6 million in revenue. So we grew exceptionally fast, but then we had this downward slope. And I called this presentation, you might have seen, the $20 million MBA, because all told, we raised a little bit over $20 million. And it's a lot of money, obviously. And I think I learned a lot about some of the really fundamental issues that I think if I had a time machine, I would have looked at differently and done differently were I able to put my brain now back into my younger brain back in 2015, Alex. And so to start on that exploration of this kind of red semicircle of death there, I wanted to first look at some of the things that we did really right, because there were a lot of things that we did exceptionally well. And if you're starting a business, if you're launching a business within a company, so if you're an entrepreneur, so to speak, or an entrepreneur, I think these are just a few things that we did really right that apply in any scenario. And the first of those is looking at the first days, the early days of the business. And you probably have seen these. I actually had a running route on the house that I lived in when I started Door.com. And I'd run up and down this street over in M Streets in Dallas. And when I started Door, I saw a for sale by owner house on that route. And I called the guy. His name was Will. He answered. He loved what we were doing. And though my hit rate definitely declined from 100%, he actually was our first listing agreement. So I called him. I said, hey, we're selling houses for $5,000. We're building technology to make this more efficient. Are you interested? And it turned out he was an app developer for Southwest. So it was a good meeting of just a lot of coincidences. But I point to the first days as something that's extraordinarily important, because I spent a lot of time calling for sale by owner houses, FSBOs, FSBOs. And let me tell you, if that doesn't sound fun, you have no idea. It is a brutal endeavor calling people, selling their house on their own, because the first person that they don't want to hear from is a real estate agent. And that's in effect what I was. I was a real estate agent saying, hey, we're trying to make things better. Come join this movement. We saw some success. It's single digits percentage of those calls started listing with us. But if you remember back to that 2016 revenue slide, that got us going. That kind of primed the pump. And it really led to something truly amazing that was a gigantic boon to the company in the early days. And that's the Dallas Morning News. And Donald Trump there's at the top, of course. I wouldn't expect anything less. But zooming in a little bit closer, you see there at the bottom half of the page, there's me. And this came from a totally random series of events, but I make a point always, and I think this is important to get coffees and lunches with people. You just never know where something's going to lead. And literally through, I think, a third or fourth person connection, I was introduced to the lady that wrote this article for the Dallas Morning News. To my understanding, she had never had a story on the cover of the Dallas Morning News. But lo and behold, in June of 2016, there we were, Door.com. Back then we were DoorHomes.com, was on the cover of the Dallas Morning News. And I don't think I'll ever forget the day after that issue debuted. I looked at my cell phone, and it was just an endless scroll of notifications from intercom, from people texting saying, "Oh my gosh," from people calling. It was pretty wild. But I point this out because the only reason that happened was because I made a point of getting coffees with random people, and because I made these calls, these horrible calls to for sale by owner houses early on to prime the pump, to jumpstart things. And so when I met Cheryl, the author for the Dallas Morning News, we had enough proof points, I think, to where we looked like a real company. We looked like something was actually going on. We weren't just talking about doing something. And as a result, we were right place, right time. We were on the cover of the Dallas Morning News. And I'll come back to this, but that catapulted us for probably a year and a half in a really big way. And I think that's important, thinking a little bit more broadly about the business, because something else that we did right, I think, was the market that we went after. I still think that a lot of this holds true, but looking at the market that we focused on, it's a really big market, and that can be dangerous. You need to, if you're starting a business, think about what the core part of the market you're targeting is. But we went after the U.S. residential real estate market, just gigantic. There's 25, $30 trillion of houses, about $100 billion of commissions every year. And what we really focused on was that blue box, if you can read that, but the $300,000 to $1 million home. Our average has pretty consistently been $400,000 to $500,000 for the homes that we transact. So we think of our target market as the mass affluent. So not the $200,000 house, not the super wealthy $5 million house, but rather the mass affluent, the $400,000 or $500,000 home, the person who is generally spending $20,000 to $30,000 in commission when they go to sell that house, which I find really hard to believe. But $20,000 or $30,000 in commission is what they're spending. That's who we focused on. The mass affluent who own homes, who are buying homes, who are transacting the $400,000 to $700,000 house. And so I think it's critical as you're thinking about your target market. One thing I certainly learned in pitch meetings with hundreds of VCs and family offices and so forth is you can't say we're targeting the residential real estate market, because that really doesn't mean anything. You need to home in on, we're targeting this particular segment of this gigantic market. I think the other thing that we really did excellently was we delivered a fantastic experience. And in our case, we measured something called Net Promoter Score. This is from 2019, but we had a Net Promoter Score of 70. And if you're familiar with Net Promoter Score, it's a measurement of how likely your customer base is to refer other people to you. So Net Promoter Score, how likely are people to promote your business for you? For us, free leads, free referrals were by far our cheapest. They were free, but by far our cheapest and best source of leads, of referrals, of deals. Because if you tell your friend, hey, I just used Door.com, it was a great experience, they saved me $10,000, you are much more likely to just say, great, I'm going to go use Door.com. It's a heavily word of mouth based and referral based industry. And I'll come back to that in some sense, because I think that's something that also makes our particular industry a particularly difficult nut to crack. But we delivered a fantastic experience to people, and that was something that I was keen on from day one. Let's deliver a better experience for less money. And the average NPS in the real estate space is more like 20, 25. So we blew that out of the water. And a final note that I'll add, and things that we did just excellently, things that we did really right, was that we really focused on people. And when I say people, I mean internally. We focused on hiring fantastic people, ensuring that we had people that were really aligned to the mission, the vision, and the values of the company, which is critical. And this was pretty early on. This is a WeWork down in Uptown, right across from Clyde Warren Park, if you know the area. And that was when we had a team of, I don't know, let's say 20 or so. And one of the greatest things of my life was watching this team grow to something substantially bigger. And there was about a year later, I think, we were up in Addison at this point. We'd outgrown WeWork. But one of the greatest experiences of my life was seeing that team grow. And it's difficult to do, I think. And I do think culture starts at the top. And I used to think that culture was this really amorphous kind of meaningless word, but I don't think that anymore. Inculcate those vision and values, the mission of the organization. And if you do it right, you really see it kind of self-replicate and spread throughout the organization. And every person we hired was really focused on that vision. I think we did that great. And I think that reinforced the Net Promoter Score we were able to deliver because people really believed in our mission and what we were doing. So that's what we did really right. But you remember that that red semicircle, things didn't turn out like I hoped they would. So what didn't work? I wanted to spend some time looking into this because there were, I think, a few really key things that we could have done better, that if I had a time machine, I would have focused on a little bit more. And so let's dig into those. The first of those was client acquisition cost, paid client acquisition cost. And I mentioned a couple of these things already, but the CAC, the client acquisition cost, is critically important to any endeavor. And I think you mostly hear about this when it comes to enterprise SaaS businesses. What's the CAC? Or maybe B2C SaaS businesses, what's the client acquisition cost for each customer? And the gigantic successes I think you tend to see, so think Uber, Zoom perhaps is a big example that's apropos right now. What they tend to have gotten right was that they got their CAC to low or maybe even zero in a lot of cases. I think Facebook benefited from that in a large part. So what a lot of these mega businesses got right is that their client acquisition cost approached zero. And so they were able to grow exceptionally quickly, and but they weren't having to pay for a bunch of marketing to acquire customers. If your client acquisition cost is higher than your lifetime value of the customer, we'll get into that, but the amount of money you make from that customer, that is a difficult equation to make work over the long run unless there's some math that makes that high CAC make sense in the long run. And so in our situation, we were starting out, you tend to pay a lot of money for marketing in the beginning relative to later, just because you're building brand awareness. But for us, that client acquisition cost bought us a customer, a client who would then hopefully refer people to us. So that's why we focus so much on NPS. I think one of the difficulties with real estate is it's something that you buy or sell a home every 7 to 10 years. So it's a very slow cycle. And so you don't have that many chances to tell people about it as compared to, let's say, Uber, where you're taking a ride a couple times a week and you can say, oh my gosh, you know how much taxis are terrible. Here, you look at this app. It's a much easier thing to refer people to. The other thing that I think that we should have focused on earlier, and this will tie into this third point that we'll make as well, but we didn't really focus on, I think, the emotion of the transaction as much as we should have in our early days, and really perhaps ever. I think that one of the difficult things with Door.com was I'm a fairly logical person, and I looked at this value proposition, and this is true. On average, we saved people about $10,000 for the first several years of the business. $10,000. I looked at that and I thought there are few, if any, situations in which the average person can save $10,000 on anything. That's an exceptionally big amount of money for someone to save. And that means a lot to me. But that's a rather logical approach to the business I've come to learn. And this business, the buying and selling of your home, is for most people an incredibly emotional decision. And so I loved this kind of funny animation of the heart holding the brain hostage. But there are 2 million real estate agents in the country, most of whom are friends or family members with a lot of people who are buying and selling houses. that is a really difficult bond to break. And I think we underestimated how difficult that bond would be to break, even despite that $10,000 average savings. So I'm still somewhat perplexed, admittedly, but even that value proposition wasn't enough to break those emotional ties in a lot of situations. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, I'm going to list with my friend or family member who's a real estate agent, even though I know I'm going to spend $10,000 more to do so, just because I feel that emotional connection, more or less. And so the key point here, I think, is really think about and ensure that you understand why people are making a decision, because the consumer is not always rational. The final thing that I want to hit on in terms of what I learned is a graph that a lot of you perhaps have seen, and this is kind of the thing that everybody deals with when you're starting a company, but it's this innovation adoption life cycle. So you have the innovators who try everything new, the early adopters who kind of tiptoe into new stuff, the early majority. That's when companies tend to get really big, is when the early majority is adopting their business. And then the late majority and the laggards. And so I always think with the late majority and the laggards, it's kind of like when the average age on Facebook went from teenagers to the teenagers' parents. You know, that is the move from the early adopters to the late majority. You see that life cycle very frequently across a lot of businesses. The real estate market's huge. It's slow moving. And when you're starting from zero, you can grow really quickly, because the average revenue per transaction, even though we were charging less than the traditional real estate agent, was quite high. For our first year, we were averaging $5,000, then $7,000. We're now at around $9,000 per transaction. And so you don't have to do that many for your revenue to grow really rapidly. And so I think looking backwards, one of the really difficult things to suss out when you're looking at the early days of your business is, are these innovators, or are these more mass market people? Because the problems are different. Because an innovator may be somebody who's willing to try something new, and they don't have the same risk profile. They don't know real estate agents in the case of Door, but it's really difficult to suss out, is this decision that people are making right now indicative of the broader population, or is this just indicative of innovators? Because I think what happened in our situation is, I'm a fairly logical person. Our investors were fairly logical, who we attracted. Our employees looked at this transaction. They thought, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. Save someone $10,000. But we attracted a lot of innovators who looked at the situation the same way. And then we attracted clients who I think largely looked at the situation the same way. And so we got a whole lot of false positives that this is what the broader market is looking for. And as you saw in 2019 and particularly 2020, as we started raising more money and marketing towards a broader population, what we started seeing was the broader population didn't really want what the early adopters, or excuse me, the innovators really wanted. So I don't think we were really out of the innovator part of this curve ever at Door. I think that we have always attracted innovators, people willing to take some slight risk. And because this cycle of buying and selling homes is so slow, because you do it infrequently, it's really hard in this space to get out of that innovator section into the early adopters or early majority section. But if you're starting a business, really think about, is this a false positive? Are these early adopters? Or is this what's going to be indicative of how the broader population makes decisions? Because between those two poles, is a really different sort of business and a really different growth trajectory over the long run. And so to round it out here in the last few minutes, I want to run through just a few things about what I learned, and hopefully some good takeaway points for everybody watching. That'll save you some heartache perhaps as you're starting your own business. The first one I think is deceptively simple, but I see so many people not do this, but it's just do one thing towards your goal every day. And in our case, that was calling for sale by owner houses. That was having coffees with people just to see what they might be able to teach me, who they might be able to introduce me to. But if you do one thing towards your goal, whatever that goal might be every day, it's more than I think 99% of the world does. And the compounding effect of that is really amazing. The other one, the next one that I think is not mentioned much, but I'm convinced is the case, is this idea that delegation is a learned skill. And I don't think we hear that talked about as being a skill much. Delegation is something managers do, something leaders do, but it's actually a skill. It's something you have to get better at. And I think if you're starting a company, you tend to be a type A person who really likes to control things. It's really hard to give that up and delegate things to other people, but you have to focus on learning how to delegate, because if you're hiring the right people, you can get so much more done together. All of us can do more than any one of us can do, but you have to give up things in order to make that happen. And finally, just a few slides on client acquisition costs, because I think it's important. Every client has an acquisition cost. That's pretty obvious. Some are free, some you have to pay for. But digging into that, there's this important formula that I think bears keeping in mind, regardless of the business that you're in. LTV, and that's a lifetime value of a client. And I think it's particularly important looking at the gross margin of a client. And then the client acquisition cost. And so that works into a formula that's pretty straightforward. What is your lifetime value divided by what is the client acquisition cost? And that gives you some sense of how fast you're going to be able to grow a business and how efficient that business is being. And I think this is perhaps a golden formula in some sense, because if your lifetime value is 10x what your client acquisition cost is, you have a lot of money to be able to profitably dump into growth. And as a final note, think about gross profit, not just revenue. One of my investors told me early on, gross profit's what a business can eat. I think it's really easy to look at the revenue of your business and get excited about that. But the gross profit of your business is really important, because that's the money that your business can eat. So if you have a software business with an 80% gross margin, each dollar of revenue is really valuable. If you have a manufacturing business with a 10% gross margin, each dollar of revenue gives you a relatively much smaller amount of money for your business to eat, to pay for the overhead that it needs to survive. So that's at end of time, and we have a few minutes for questions, and happy to take any questions anybody has. And if you have any follow-ups, feel free to email me. There's my email address on the screen right there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex. As an entrepreneur, you had me at delegation. Always a huge problem, I think, for all entrepreneurs to be able to let go. But yes, I encourage everyone to put questions. We've got a couple minutes. I did want to ask you, you talked about, one of the biggest things that you didn't account for was your cost of client acquisition. Has that decreased? Have you figured out how to get that number down?
I would say on balance, not enough. And I think what the Dallas Morning News was kind of a blessing and a curse. And what the Dallas Morning News did was it really covered up the client acquisition cost for probably 2 years, because that was just such a broadly reaching publication, still is, that attracted dozens, if not hundreds of clients that kind of falsely lowered our client acquisition costs for a couple of years. But it was really hard to tell, just because the effect of that front page story was lingering and went on for a long time. And so the number of referrals that we were getting was artificially inflated due to the Dallas Morning News for quite some time.
Interesting. So along those same lines, you talked about, your curve. You start out attracting the innovators. How do you attract the innovators, and then how do you move that into the early adopters? What do you do differently to attract the adopters versus the innovators?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was a blessing and a curse for us is just how fast we grew. I think we got accustomed to growing 200 or 300% a year, and so we're continuing to try to do that, because the space is obviously big enough to grow that fast for a long time, $100 billion a year in commissions. And so I think if I had a time machine again, I would have lowered expectations, not that I wanted to not grow quickly, but been a little bit more judicious in how we spent funds, and stretched out our runway to ensure that we had time to figure exactly that question out, because referrals take a long time in this business. Like I mentioned, 7 or 8 years is the average cycle. And so I think with real estate in particular, because it's such an expensive transaction, you really have to win people's trust. And in the real estate world, I don't think we're going to see real mass disruption of the status quo until some brand is able to do that. And I just think that's going to take decades, perhaps, in the real estate world.
Interesting. And we're going to wrap it up with Dan's question. First of all, he says, thank you for this excellent presentation. And then what's the outlook for Door in 2020, 2021?
Yeah, the outlook for Door this year and next year is really pandemic dependent. And I'm sure a lot of businesses are in that same boat, but the pandemic has been the single biggest factor for us struggling this year. And had the pandemic not happened, frankly, this would have been a great year. We would have been profitable. We would have been growing. And but the pandemic did happen. So no way around that. Our business model is in some sense predicated on getting a lot of listings because we have employee agents who sell 5 to 7 houses a month rather than for a year, which is what the average agent does. And so when inventory is down 45% year over year, as it is in North Texas, just the overall volume of houses is really constrained. So sellers are worried about putting their house on the market right now. And I think the only thing that's going to fix that is a vaccine and getting back to some semblance of normalcy. And so I look towards the middle of next year as when we will see some semblance of normalcy in the housing market. And I just hope that people get back to being comfortable with buyers walking through their house when a vaccine is distributed widely. But that's the one thing that is really impeding us returning to normalcy.
All right. Well, we are out of time. Thank you, Alex. That was a wonderful presentation, and we wish you continued success.